Hello, hello. I am Peyton, and I'm excited to be talking to you right now. I feel like I did a podcast before, but I feel like I kind of kept burning myself out. So I'm taking a different approach where it's just going to be a little bit more casual than I was doing before. But I think if I keep it more casual, it will be more sustainable work for me. So that's kind of the goal here. We're talking Light in the Dark, Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, Reality by Gloria Anzaldúa and Ana Luis Keating. And I have to say, Gloria Anzaldúa died in 2004, and this book was published 11 years after that. So she did not get to see this work come to light. And, it's interesting because I came to read Gloria Anzaldúa in college, my first year of college, for a teacher's education class. It was a class with Dr. Baker Bell, Dr. April Baker Bell. And I had never really seen like my family's history specifically as Mexican Americans. That was the first time I experienced seeing things that made sense to my family and my, what I experienced growing up. That was the first time I saw it in an academic setting, and it was genuinely life-changing. And I always, and this part's maybe a little silly, but I always felt like there were these odd synchronicities that kept happening where, Gloria Anzaldúa had a roommate named Leslie, and that's my mom's name, and her middle name is my cousin's name, and my cousin is named after me, so all of the names felt very aligned. And there was one part in Borderlands where she says, a Chicana from Detroit or Michigan is no less a Chicana than those from Texas. And like, I was someone that my grandpa always told me I was Tejana growing up, but I never lived in Texas. So I was like, I don't think that's true. But then I just didn't really know what to call myself. And so I don't know. It really did feel like Gloria Anzaldúa was speaking directly to me. And in some ways, she was, but it's kind of cool how really I would say that like I came to spirituality through Gloria Anzaldúa specifically. I think more broadly feminist theory, specifically like that cohort of thinkers that was writing in the 80s and 90s. A lot of their work was really deeply analytical, like structurally talking about structural inequalities, but also on like a deeper psychological level and on a spiritual level. And I think that they did that, like zooming in and out of the personal and the political so well in a way that like I just don't think that people are doing it these days. I think to some extent that's been co-opted for not so good purposes, but anyway, let's get into talking about this book. So we're starting with the preface. Okay, that's what this episode is going to be about. And the preface is Gestures of the Body. So she begins the preface by sort of setting the scene, a very, I would say, spiritual scene of her writing at night under la luna. And she starts to, this is kind of the idea of the preface, but she develops this idea of conocimiento, which is she talks about as insight, inward knowledge, embodied knowledge. So she says writing is a process of discovery and perception that produces knowledge and conocimiento, insight. I am often driven by the impulse to write something down, by the desire and urgency to communicate, to make meaning, to make sense of things, to create myself through this knowledge-producing act. And then she calls the shadow beast, or the flip side of it, desconocimientos, or the ignorance we cultivate to keep ourselves from knowledge so that we can remain unaccountable. What a fucking call out, right? So she's talking about knowledge that we know in our bones, and then the ignorance, the ideology that we, use to remain unaccountable to acting with what we knew is true. What we know is true. So desconocimientos is not what you don't know, it's what you don't want to know. And that's a big difference for her. She writes of Nepantla, which is, she calls it the point of contact and the place between worlds, el lugar, between worlds, between imagination and physical existence, between ordinary and non-ordinary or spirit realities. She says Nepantlas are places of constant tension. And she also says that, when she's writing, it's not that she's having to deal with each particular point. She basically is saying that all of these points, all of these nepantlas inhabit her and inevitably surface in whatever she's writing. So she's talking about writing as a spiritual act. She says, Soy la que escribe y se escribe. I am the one who writes and who is being written. Últimamente es el escribir que me escribe. It is the writing that writes me. I read and speak myself into being. Writing is the site where I critique reality, identity, language, and dominant culture's representation and ideological control. Using a multidisciplinary approach and a storytelling format, I theorize my own and others' struggles for representation, identity, self-inscription, and creative expressions. And one of the things that she writes about that she's talking about in writing, but I think writing, it is a way of looking at things. It is a way of documenting, like, ideas, right? And coming up with those ideas. That's one of the things that she says in the preface. But she says, I speak in tongues, understand the languages, emotions, thoughts, fantasies of the various sub-personalities inhabiting me and the various grounds they speak from. To do so, I must figure out which person, I, she, you, we, them, they, which tense, present, past, future, which language and register and which voice or style to speak from. Identity formation, which involves reading and writing oneself and the world, is an alchemical process that synthesizes the dualities, contradictions, and perspectives from these different selves and worlds. I simultaneously look at myself as subject and object. I can't help but think that, like, I would have loved for Gloria Anzaldúa to have a conversation with Karen Barad and also Robin Wall Kimmerer. Because again, like, I use those three in my dissertation and I tried to put them in my own conversation of sorts. But like, Karen Barad talks about how matter comes to meaning and how meaning comes to matter and how language sort of constructs reality, but also how, I mean, I'm not going to summarize all of what Barad says. Absolutely not. But I just mean, like, in terms of the way that matter comes to matter is one of the things that Barad talks about. But like, that compared to like the Robin Wall Kimmerer talked about restoration in Braiding Sweetgrass. Anzaldúa talks about how we come to understand the world through stories and through narrative. And she says the writing process is the same mysterious process that we use to make the world. It is a way of making meaning. It is a way of organizing thought. And you know, one of the things that I appreciate, because I guess I've never really put it into words, but it is such a magical part of the writing process, is that, like, when you go to write something, you're making the discoveries as you write. That's what she says. I make these discoveries as I write and not before. I uncover and release the energy shaping each piece, discover its premise, ideas, counter ideas, controlling ideas, and arch plot. I track what lies beyond the originating idea, trace its turning point, its emotional dynamic, and the linking of its parts. I treat each essay as story with antagonism, dialogue, crisis, climax, resolution, and poetics. I don't write from any single disciplinary position. I write outside official, theoretical, and philosophical language. Mine is a struggle of recognizing and legitimizing excluded selves, especially of women, people of color, queer, and othered groups. I organize and order these ideas as stories. I believe that it is through narrative that you come to understand and know yourself and make sense of the world. Through narrative, you formulate your identities by unconsciously locating yourself in social narratives not of your own making. Your culture gives you your identity story. Pero en un buscando rompimiento con la tradición, you create an alternative identity story. Ultimately, what she's articulating here is that writing is a way of working with the universe, right? Like, not necessarily going into it with these ideas that are already formed that you are in full ownership over. But as a process, you're part of the creative process. I was listening to Channy Nicholas recently, and she was talking about self-doubt in the creative process and how, you know, your job when you're creating something and you inevitably feel some self-doubt about something along the process, your job is to recognize it and be like, you know, there it is. Because self-doubt just kind of means you're a conscious, you know, self-aware, self-reflective being that is creating something which is vulnerable. Channy's advice was to sort of zoom out and think about yourself as just part of a creative process. You're part of what it is that you're bringing into fruition. If you can be the thing doing it. You're just part of it. You're part of whatever it is that is being offered to the world. And if you get too caught up in ego, if you get too caught up in, you know, And to be honest, I think that that's kind of where she goes with this book. I think to some extent, she's both like validating the corporeal realities of all of these structural inequalities with racism and xenophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, all of it. Like she's fully acknowledging that grounded, lived experience and structural way of organizing people. And at the same time, she's searching for something so much deeper than that, right? She's like, that is not where the work ends. That's not where the work ends. And ultimately something that they talk about, the editor talks about specifically before the preface, is spiritual activism, the spiritual layer of activism, but also like that's what their conversations were about before Gloria's passing. There was this radical, politically aware spiritual activism that was going on that I just can't help but feel is increasingly, I'm being called to it personally. I'm seeing other people around me being called to do this kind of work on like an internal level where they don't particularly align with any religion. They maybe come from an atheist background or at some point have like sort of identified that way, but then felt like that was a little bit nihilistic and that like that didn't feel fully aligned. And so, through even learning about science and like there are a lot of people that come to spirituality through quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And, there are other people that come to spirituality from ecology and mycology and the fucking mycelial network, the mycorrhizal network. And, I know a lot of people that sort of like spirituality and manifestation sort of clicked for them and made more sense to them once they understood how trees send out their signals to each other and take care of one another, and how it is natural for all flourishing to be mutual, right? I'm excited to be talking about this. When I say that Gloria Anzaldúa brought me to my spirituality, I really don't mean that lightly. She is tattooed on my body, a quote here, but like she's on my altar. I work with her as like an ancestor, as like a, not bloodline ancestor, but this like undeniable, energy linkage that I try to tap into. But one of the things that I really respected that I remember her writing about, and I bought the cards. I would have to look where it was that she wrote it, because she's written a lot. But I might have been This Bridge Called Me Back. I'm not sure though. But she said that as she prepared to do the writing for that piece, she pulled a card from her animal medicine card deck. And like that helped guide her writing that day. And I really thought that was beautiful. And I think it's something that I've been, trying to bring together these different parts of myself, my spirituality and my like academic background, because in my mind, it is all one and the same. But I don't know. I think sometimes in academia, there are quite a few people who are incredibly critical of spirituality, where as soon as you mention it, you're sort of discredited as an academic. And then on the other side, I have a lot of complaints about people that consider themselves to be spiritual, but do it in a very spiritual bypassy way, where they're not dealing with like unpacking their own internalized white supremacy. They're just like, I don't know. That's a different podcast. But anyway, I've been blending that, and I started a new TikTok, doing, collective tarot readings for funsies called Dr. Del Tarot. But I think something that I want to do just as a practice with this podcast is to pull a card. So we'll see. I might play around with like the format of when I want to pull it, whether I want it to be before I do the podcast or after. But right now we're going to do it as close. So let's see. This is really, really cute, you guys. The Ace of Swords and the Ace of Cups came out. This is, okay. Ace cards are always new beginnings. Cups are, the suit of emotion. They hold the water. They're fluid. So the Ace of Cups is like a beginning about something that's going to be, emotionally fulfilling. And then Ace of Swords, same thing with the ace there, but swords is about the mind, the intellect, the way that you think about things. And so this really does feel really good. It feels really good as like a confirmation that, I don't know, some good will come from this new version of doing the podcast. As a final message, part of what my goal in my life, in this work right now, in this spread, what I'm picking up is, I think a lot of us have been really clear about what we don't stand for, what we really hate about the world. And I think for a lot of us, it's easy to get trapped in that energy. It's easy to get sort of stuck playing defense. I've been wanting to play a more offensive game, not offensive like in a bad way, but like I want to be, building the world I want to see. I want to be educating people about what I do believe in and not just always harping on about what I don't. I think part of what a lot of people struggle with when it comes to imagining that some other reality is possible for all of us is that they can't imagine it. They can't imagine it. And the idea of even trying seems like false hope. And I think the more that we all embody the things that we want to see and show what is possible and live it and lead by example, so to speak. I think that that's ultimately what is not only going to be more successful, but I think it's going to also feel better, right? One of my favorite things that Kimmer talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass is, she's teaching this class of ecology students, and all of these ecology students are adamant. They're all majors of like environmental justice or something. And so they are well aware of like the atrocities that humans have committed against the earth. And so when she asked them in like an initial seminar, can you imagine any beneficial relationships between humans and the land? And none of them could think of anything. She sort of stops and asks, like, if you can't even imagine what this relationship that you say we're working towards even looks like or feels like, how can we possibly even think about getting there? And so I think that I'm hoping that this podcast is like part of it for you, and it's definitely a big part of it for me. But like, I think that's what I'm starting to try to push myself to feel, not just know that it's possible, but like, I want to feel it. And so, yeah, here's our invitation. Good luck to us both. And I'll see you back here for chapter 1.